really excited to do this for a while. Prepared for it for a long time, took me even longer to research it, and even longer than that to think up these ideas. So I'm incredibly excited to share it with actual people. So first of all, thank you to Professor Wolf for kind of guiding me through this. Super exciting, extremely tedious process through the paper writing and research just as it went. So I kind of want to jump into it because I don't want to go terribly over on time, and I have a lot that I want to say. So the basic overall premise of this project is, well, do metacognitive efforts contribute to us fostering a mindful civil discourse? Well, what the hell does that mean? Quite simply, I've narrowed it down to a call for character in our politics, in our society, and how we treat and interact with one another. So, first of all, kind of what I want to show you is to drive home the point that we're overwhelmed by information. Well, sort of what that means is it often feels like whenever we're trying to read, consume, and being bombarded by news information, this is often what we're seeing, right? So I want you just for a second, try and focus on everything that's happening in this this function that's on the screen. This is a kind of a fun diagram that we get from cognitive psychology. And the moral of the story with this is there is no scientific, logical way for us to focus and comprehend on everything that's happening here. You might be able to, say this one's switching from 1 and 0 back and forth quite rapidly in this bottom left corner, but we can't really do more than that. So the parallel I kind of want to draw here is this is often what it feels like whenever I have a New York Times alert or Twitter's blowing up and people are retweeting and I don't know what's going on. So that's to me kind of what it feels like when we're getting news information today. So this sort of leads us into our problem statement, right? We're overwhelmed by information, and that information is still growing. We are still kind of not sure of what to do about it. We're not sure what to do with it, and it's still coming at us. And where's it coming at us from? Well, we have it from social media, and we have it from our more traditional mass media information networks that are also slowly taking over on social media as well. So we kind of have these two actors working with one another, not to mention our state of political polarization today. So where do we even start with all of this? And for the students that are here today that have to kind of take on the feat of this research project this semester, please don't go into it knowing or thinking that you have your entire project all figured out. This is certainly not where we began with everything. My initial thoughts and plans for how things were going to go ultimately didn't happen that way. But then again, that's life, right? So please trust the process. If you have a general idea, interest, or passion that you want to pursue, read, watch, listen to everything that you can about it. Find something that is appealing to you, and then once you have that, my best advice I can give is find a specific component of that and narrow in on it, and figure out what's not there yet. Figure out what your contribution is going to be to the already existing literature, to the already existing knowledge. What can you contribute? So for me, where do we start with this? Well, this term political polarization is something that's kind of thrown around back and forth in sort of the public view. But I think we need to distinguish what we mean between political polarization, isolation, and tribalism. These are three terms that are quite often used interchangeably between media pundits, between academics, to talk about kind of how divided that we all are. So while they all kind of are rooted in the same intent, I don't think that we should operate moving forward believing that they're all interchangeable. Because while they are all related, I kind of think it muddies the waters even further for us to think that they are one and the same. So polarization is more or less what we see in this kind of diagram. This diagram here is taken from a research study that was done on retweets on Twitter of liberal and conservative users. The kind of polarization that's emerged here is, well, we see that they're kind of stuck in between their own two groups, right? Not interacting with each other, which sort of leads us into them being isolated. Once this sort of polarization occurs, these groups tend to be isolated from one another, right? We're not interacting. We're sort of in our in-groups, stuck in those group things. And that ultimately leads us to the tribalistic nature of it. So once we've identified ourselves as a part of, say, a Republican or conservative group, we're then kind of turning a little bit hostile towards the liberal users or the more left-leaning viewpoints. So of course you can see how these things are all related, but I think it's more helpful if we distinguish it and look at it through a flow effect. So this is kind of the thing that has led us to where we are today. After certainly the last presidential election, there was a lot of talk about these things and little exploration, which kind of laid the groundwork nicely for where we're going here. So I took a psychological lens on it, and you might ask, well, why psychology, right? So there's a branch of psychology known as political psychology, and we're kind of examining the role of psychological perception along two key factors here. So we're focused on that overwhelming amount of information that we're getting in our world on a news front, and we're focused on the state of polarization, both politically and socially. So that kind of leads me to identify this kind of gap in existing research that we have. So we're lacking exploration between political polarization, psychological understanding of these information processes, and the role that our media consumption habits play in all of this, right? Little has been done to identify these things. So further in the political psychology literature, not to nerd out on you too much, but this is important background information for the purposes of this report. We have these kind of three key theories that stick out when we're talking about these things: agenda setting effect, hostile media phenomenon, and selective exposure theory. Just briefly, I'm going to explain those things, right? So agenda setting effect, the most probably well-known phrase when it comes to agenda setting effect is the news media isn't very successful in telling you what to think, but they're quite successful in telling you what to think about, right? Most news networks, channels, programs are typically showing you some flavor of the same story, right? So they're kind of setting the agenda. And this sort of leads us to the hostile media phenomenon. They are kind of, they're loosely related, I would say. The hostile media phenomenon is more, if I'm conservative, stereotypically, I'm going to be watching Fox News, and I'm going to sort of have this hostile media mindset towards those programs and those networks, those pundits, what have you, that I perceive to not agree with my beliefs. I'm going to start rejecting those things as fact. We have all heard of these things, especially in recent years, things like fake news and such. So that kind of leads us to this selective exposure theory. And well, what is that? That is, well, if I'm that conservative viewer watching Fox News, or I'm that stereotypical, more liberal viewer viewing MSNBC, I'm going to kind of stick with those sources that I think are going to more make me secure in my belief system. Well, this kind of leads us to my topic of metacognition. If you don't know what metacognition is, it's simply the act of thinking about your own thinking. Only one study to date has investigated this variable of metacognitive processes within the context of political ideology. And furthermore, none of these studies, well, this study in particular, but none of these studies, these disciplines, have been carried out in the United States in this fashion. But I mean, we do have plenty of neuroscience literature that kind of tells us that we should be employing metacognitive strategies for these tasks that require us to make decisions. Its relationship, however, especially in this context, isn't defined whatsoever. And it really would be of value to us for further exploration. And that's sort of what we're doing here. And that leads me to sort of the purpose of all of this. Well, where are we going? The why of all of it. Well, so what we have is a wealth of information about media choice, what people like to watch, the science of perception, political polarization, and of course there's many more things out there. What we have is lack of synthesis. So little has been done as well to shift the conversation beyond the realm of these kind of academic circles, right? So we want to do more than just fill the gaps that are in this existing literature. We want to do more than simply say, oh, there were XYZ gaps in the research. I ran this empirical study, and this is sort of what we could do moving forward. I want to know what practical applications that we can have in this, and what does it mean for us moving forward. And that may very well include laying the groundwork for future relevant empirical study. So this evaluation, this current study, this investigation, is an effort to yield against those remedies of, to remedy against rather, disinformation, and to kind of show people what we gain when we do not operate with partisan blinders, and kind of how we become in a state to do that, right? So this leads us to our theoretical framework. So what we have are working understandings of kind of the psychological components of all of this. We know how psychology works quite well, still thriving special science. And we have these components of political polarization as well as the media. Well, when we throw in increased metacognitive awareness through things like media literacy interventions, through teaching people literally how to think about their own thinking, we might see two things, and I would hypothesize that we're going to see these three things total, if done correctly and if done widespread enough. So one is increased self-efficacy. Self-efficacy traditionally, more generally, is that feeling empowered to act through this intrinsic motivation. You know, I'm acting for the sake of my own, my belief in my ability to make a difference. In a political context, you know, we hear a lot, my vote doesn't matter, my voice doesn't matter, some variation of that. I think if we teach people how to really think about the information that they're consuming, I think we kind of break that mold a little bit. We kind of are being able to teach individuals that, well, this is how your voice matters, and this is kind of how we need to shift the thinking of that. And between these two things specifically, I think we might start to see a greater likelihood of informed political participation, and hopefully, this leads us to an embodiment of a mindful civil discourse. So this is sort of the whole host of this metacognitive strategy. It's teaching people how to more closely identify the information that you're getting, how to lessen the overwhelming nature of it, and really sit back and say, well, yeah, that's kind of BS, or yeah, this is true, and here's how I know how to make that distinction moving forward. So the kind of review of the existing literature that we have is, one, our human nature. We know that we're wired to belong to social groups. We're social species. So we know that aspect of us. And then, of course, we have our media biases acting together. We're seeing a more divided media landscape. And then, of course, we cannot forget the role of the media. Those stated objectives from people like Kovacs and Rosenstiel, two prominent journalists who laid out the main objectives of news media, such as loyalty to citizens, loyalty to truth-telling and objectiveness, etc., etc. And then we have these psychological, political information processes, examining this self-efficacy, examining the sort of science that is behind these things. And well, where does that lead us? That leads us to a place where we can begin to cultivate solutions. That is things like media literacy interventions. There's some early empirical study on that. To be honest with you, just within the past probably 6 months or so, there's been probably a handful of studies that have just recently emerged. So this is a pretty current hot topic when it comes to, well, how do we remedy this sort of division in our country? And that's sort of the gist of what we have out there. Of course, there's a ton more, but this sort of leads me to the kind of centering point of the main thing that I wish to say to you today. This is what I want the contribution to be, and this is what I'm most excited to tell you about. Now, this framework, this web that I've kind of put together, looks scary as hell. Looks very overwhelming, complicated, and yeah, it is to an extent. So I want to spend a minute just walking you through this. This is my working theory of achievement and well-being. Well, what does that mean? So right now, we focus on this kind of mindfulness, this metacognitive stance. This is where we've been throughout this discussion. Well, this sort of everything is the bigger picture of everything. So we have things that are all leading us to a sense of well-being. Well, what is well-being? The PERMA model established by Marty Seligman, who's at the University of Pennsylvania, puts it as this. It's having positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. Well, we have to kind of unpack all of those things in terms of making them applicable to us. So we have things like growth mindset, optimistic self-talk, and grit, these sort of strengths of will. This passion and perseverance for long-term goals that propels us forward. This is our achievement aspect of it. Well, we have to cultivate meaning somehow and foster our relationships. This sort of requires of us to have a keen sense of self-awareness and this metacognitive strategy. The piece of the metacognition, of course, only deals with politics just a little bit. This is saying more about the character of ourselves and about our country. And of course, the two things here that are important is accounting for our perfectionistic mindsets and kind of moving towards a healthy striving aspect. That more growth mindset comes back into play when we talk about healthy striving. This sort of healthy synthesis of all these things is different for everybody. That is worth noting. But when we sort of find our flow, our psychology of optimal experience, I think we can find a way to be well. Now, there is plenty of empirical study out there, scientific inquiry about all of these things. It can get very complex and detailed. I love Angela Duckworth. I love Carol Dweck. There's a lot out there for if you're interested. I could talk to you about hours for it, but I just simply don't have time right now. So what is my point in telling you all of this? And that sort of leads me to what it all means. So I didn't have the chance in this specific project to do empirical study. And sort of the next step for me, I hope, is we need to test it. We need some empirical research that addresses these things more clearly. And I'm currently in the process of trying to achieve that here at GW. But I bear this in mind. I often have conversations with people and I say, we cannot force, we cannot legislate people to be good per se. So this sort of brings me back to what I began with, and that's a call to character. Well, we have to talk about what does that mean. Character means different things for different people. And I would argue, and probably a lot of you would agree, that it's the following: to have a strength of mind, a strength of will, and a strength of heart. And this is sort of what that looks like. So let's rebrand for a second that term metacognition as character. So how do we foster strengths of character? We have mind, heart, and will. Well, if we foster strengths of mind, we foster things like curiosity and zest. I encourage all of us to become curious about the processes that help us function as a society, that help us interact with each other, that cultivate meaning in our lives, and that sort of bring us all together to keep that zest alive in the fabric of America. So that sort of leads us to the strength of heart, which is fostering purpose and gratitude. You know, identifying purposes and interests in our lives, and hopefully developing passion, and being grateful for the things that we have so far. This does so much to help us achieve well-being and propel us forward. And of course, with that comes will, which is grit and self-control, to kind of have this passion and perseverance for long-term goals. So what does all of this mean together? There's far more out there than our divisiveness. And I want us more than anything to be able to incorporate all of these things when we're in our political conversation. These are real people. There's no need for the divisive rhetoric. There's no need for the bickering or the quite crude name calling. We're better than that, and this is, I think, how we get there. So, and I do think truly from the bottom of my heart together that we will get there. So